Every lawyer I knew said, don't take that. Every non-lawyer I knew said, you got to take this opportunity.
It's a lot of things to unpack.
That is like literally the Monday morning reason I wake up.
I can imagine that would be super rewarding.
It was a, trial by fire type of situation.
So we're super excited because today we're joined by Josh Seidenfeld, all the way from the US. Josh, you have a super interesting background. You were an athlete in college, you've gone to business school, you've started your own business, and you've worked at a startup, and you've even worked at the Raiders, and now you're a partner at Cooley. It's a lot of things to unpack. So can you just tell me a little bit about your background and how you ended up where you are now?
Of course. Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and obviously happy to share background and some of those details. So thanks for asking. Um, so I was, very much an athlete growing up. So played all kinds of different sports. And if you had asked the high school version of me what I wanted to do with my life, I would have said, if I can, I want to be a professional athlete on some level. Maybe I'll end up playing abroad and, living in the States a couple months a year. That was the goal I had, and started working towards that. That's kind of been this, I think the theme of, my career has always been trying to figure out what the North Star is and how I work towards achieving that objective at the end of the day. And so originally it was the sports path. So I went to a college that happened to just move up in the level of competition they played in. So historically they were in a lower division. I thought that would be an easier path for, a 6 foot tall person to try to, play sports at the collegiate level. And then ultimately, as I was doing that, I had a sports injury. Also just started thinking more about, what I wanted out of my life, and if I wanted to be someone that was going to go to college for 5 or 6 years, or if I wanted to kind of get on with my career. And so it kind of gave me a moment to look up and really think about what made sense for me. And originally I wasn't positive which direction I wanted to go in. I knew I always had an intellectual curiosity about the law. I thought it was always really interesting. I like TV shows like Suits, so why not? And then ultimately, what I decided was I wasn't going to make a decision when I was in school at university, and what I wanted to try to do was get as much exposure as I could to all career paths and give myself as much flexibility to get there. So I started doing a path of saying, okay, I need to get myself into a dual degree JD MBA program. What can I do at university to try to help increase my odds of doing so? And so started looking at certain kinds of jobs I might take and roles I would have, and then ultimately making sure that my grades were appropriate, and not playing sports anymore. I had so much more free time that it really allowed me to focus on academics. And so I went from, maybe whatever it was, a B plus student to like pretty much a straight A student. That does not hurt when you're thinking about grad school. So then ultimately did the dual degree program, came to the Bay Area for that, in particular into Silicon Valley, and went to Santa Clara University, which for a regional school has a very good reputation in the area. And so I knew that would be an enabler depending on which path I wanted to take, whether it was kind of a more business focused role or a legal role. To test out some of these theories, I basically had an idea when I was a sophomore. I started a company that I had worked on that was basically an internet sales company, was selling a lot of consumer electronic goods and then corporate marketing material. In some cases, they were essentially the same product, just branded differently depending on who I was selling to. Actually raised money from a lawyer who helped me form the company, was an advisor to me. Thought that was a really interesting path. And then ultimately, when I went to grad school, decided to exit that business and then really just focus on academics, given how important that is for career placement, especially coming out of a school that you essentially needed to finish, in a relatively significant position in order to find yourself with one of the, I think the careers that people were most interested in coming out of school. And so if you had talked to the first year law student version of me, which is how the JD MBA program works, I would have said, no clue. I think I probably want to be a business person. And then what I found was through most of the roles that I had, through a lot of the interviews I had, the focus on those roles and the type of activity that I was going to be doing on a day-to-day basis, and the levels of people that you communicate with within a corporation, very different than the kinds of people that you engage with in a law firm-based practice. And I just found the law firm environment for me personally to actually be something that was more interesting and exciting on a day-to-day basis for lots of reasons, including the fact that it wasn't a single boss. It was multiple CEOs that I get to work with across their companies. helping them solve problems versus, a single company that I might know better than I would in the environment I'm in now. But I also get kind of that diversity of portfolio, which I really enjoy. People that get recruited and go work in law firms, like it's a very particular type of person. At least I generally find that. And I really appreciate the fact of like just like the pure dedication and motivation of people that join law firms. Like it's just so impressive to me when you see some of these students that come out and people that have been doing it for a long time. Even today, like when I think about the end of the year and holidays for people, it's like it's amazing how much dedication people have, and I don't see that in every environment I've ever worked in. And so as I saw that through some internship work and working with outside counsel, that kind of led me closer and closer to say, okay, the environment, the types of people, the way the work is transitioned, the kinds of things I get to work on, that all started pointing me down toward the path of saying, okay, I'm going to go down and I'm going to start on the legal path. And ultimately, once I made it to the firm, I happened to fall into one that I couldn't be happier with at Cooley. And ultimately that was one of those things where I wasn't sure I would even stay through my first couple of years. So first 4 years in the firm, I might have said, I don't know what I'll end up doing. And then once I got through my fourth year, I decided to make the push to say, okay, I want to try to be a partner in the firm. And so I'm going to do all the things that you need to do in order to see if I can get there.
So do you think, kind of going back to when you were at university, you mentioned like you just wanted to open up different pathways. Do you think with like all of the kind of extra work that getting a law degree requires in the States, it's not just an undergraduate, that many people do that? Or do you think a lot of people who study law have decided, no, this is what I want to do, like I'm going to pursue this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's actually interesting. I was at a holiday party for one of my clients over the weekend, and I ran into someone I went to law school with. And we were relatively close in law school. Like we studied together. We've stayed in contact, but we haven't been quite as close. And one of the comments that he made was, because I had said it would be great for us to have a reunion. Like I haven't seen anyone that we've graduated with in a long time other than a handful of folks. And his comment was, well, I think it's because most people like aren't still lawyers. You might be the only person we know that's still in a law firm at this point. And I thought that was an interesting comment. But the reality of it is, like, I don't think most people that go to law school say definitively they want to be lawyers in big firms. I think there are some people that, are fortunate enough that they've grown up in that background where maybe their parents are lawyers. They've seen what it's like. They decide they want to do it, or they were a paralegal before, then they go to law school and they know they're going to go sign back up for that role because they like it. I think more people than not maybe go in with the idea of what they think they want to do. And then the reality of what that practice looks like or what that experience is really changes the dynamic of exactly where you find the best fit. I mean, for a lot of people, they don't love the billable hour, and so it's easier to go in-house. Or some people decide that they want to do something that's more tangential to, like day-to-day life instead of like corporate work. And so they transition to, more of a public domain. And I've seen people do that, go from big law to like the public sector or something like that. And I think lawyers tend to be very curious people and like learning about, the industries that they work in. And so it doesn't surprise me that you see big shifts. And so I don't know that most people go in with something that's really set. And I think the ones that do probably change their mind after a couple of years anyways.
And so your time at the Raiders, that must have been quite a cool experience given your interest in sports. Was that your first chance of getting legal experience, or had you had experience before then?
So the only experience I've had before roles like that were basically, like programs I'd done in university or just my own personal experience dealing with lawyers. And that was like the first, quote unquote legal job that I took. And again, I tried to take advantage of the scenario I was in. So they were, as far as I knew, they were the only football team that basically had an internship program. And usually they would do the internship program in the summer. And so folks like me would be competing with people across the US that are going to, law schools that I think had higher academic rankings than the one that I did. And so I intentionally said, look, is there a way I can do this like in the fall semester? And I would do it for credits at school so that there was no payment issue for the company, the organization of the Raiders. And then number two, it really shrunk the pool of people I was competing with, because now it just came down to like folks that were at Berkeley or at Hastings and Santa Clara, because those are the only relevant ones to be willing to commute. And it turned out that I wasn't the only one with this idea. Someone who took off from McGill University in Canada literally left their school so they could take this job for one semester. And then there was also another individual I met that was going to Berkeley, and so it was the three of us during that period. But it did, I think, help with the opportunity, and it was the first chance to really see what it's like to be, a lawyer with inside of a business organization, and a pretty unique one at that, given it was a football team.
So what kind of work were you doing when you were at the Raiders?
Most of the work that I was doing was employment-related legal work. So essentially, there are a lot of contracts that the players sign with the teams. Those contracts put certain types of incentives and certain penalties. A lot of the penalties are actually related to performance. So as an example, if you are not under certain weight guidelines, you might get docked some of your pay. And the players then would go through a grievance process if they felt like that wasn't being monitored fairly. So you can imagine a situation where you weigh someone in the morning, and then you weigh them in the evening. There's a difference due to, quote unquote, water weight. And ultimately, like, that could result in thousands of dollars of dock pay. So there'd be some employment related disputes. And the team wanted to make sure they had their own counsel in that process and not just use league counsel. So that was one type of assignment. And then there were a lot of things that were more broadly focused around the collective bargaining agreement and how individual organizations would interpret what their rights are for different, economic programs. So as an example, do you have to, go into a profit sharing model if you, sell a box to certain types of corporate clients? Or what if you put advertisements on a player's jersey or in the stadium or in a green screen behind someone doing an interview? Is that a rev share, or is that something the team gets to keep? And so I was looking into some of that and some of the discussion that people had around the CBA and kind of helping the firm think through those kinds of things as well. So interesting things that I had never done before and was trying to learn from scratch. But I think that's what lawyering tends to be.
Yeah, that I imagine it's some really unique aspects of law that you definitely wouldn't have touched on when you were at university. Do you think you said that you had to learn from scratch? Was it quite a structured program where you had people helping you all the time, or how did you actually learn the law from scratch? Because I think a lot of junior lawyers enter the practice and then they worry, how do they actually know how to do the law? It's not like what it was like at university.
It's a great question, and in this role, it was a trial by fire type of situation. So a lot of it was just stepping back and saying, okay, you learned research skills in law school, how to figure out an issue that you've never seen before, and go do case law research and figure out what the interpretations are, and is there majority and minority viewpoints, those kinds of things, or how much you delineate between various facts to come to what the rule ultimately is. In this instance, it was a little bit more simplified from that, because you essentially have a rulemaking process where there's, individuals commenting on why we're doing something, what the intent is, what we're not trying to cover. And so between going back and looking at, like, I would say the same thing as like, historical legislation and a process to get there, you could start to interpret, okay, this is how you should read the prose of this particular paragraph. Looking at what was there before, how it got amended, noticing there's a change in language, so therefore it can't mean the same thing that it meant before if people had changed it. So it was just an exercise in kind of really thinking through how you interpret contracts, and then scrapping for every data point I possibly could. And then thankfully the existing legal team at the Raiders was very kind, and they were great mentors. And so to the extent you had questions, they would always help point you in the right direction. But these were all case of first impressions. So it was all relatively new. And candidly, that's what it's like when you join, I think, a big law firm for the most part. I mean, they can give you all the training in the world, but when someone says, go do a formation of a company, you would have never done that in law school, and you don't really know where to start. And so you are building blocks that you're going to use for the longevity of your career. It just so happened I was building blocks that I think were helpful for a broader skill set, but not specific to staying in a football organization.
And so after that, how did you then get your summer associate role at Cooley? It would be super interesting to hear how the process kind of differs from in Australia and New Zealand getting like summer clerkships and that kind of thing.
For me, my process was maybe less thoughtful than I think a lot of students go through, but I'll still knock on wood to this day. I think I got pretty lucky. So essentially in the US, there's a program for summer associatehood where you basically, the actual law firms come onto campus and do something called on-campus interviews. And what that looks like is you submit over the summertime before you're going to start like that first quarter or semester of law school. You will submit all of your information. So you essentially are doing cover letters, you're doing your resume, and you're doing like maybe a writing sample, some other, whatever it is that they're asking for at the time, plus your transcripts of your grades. And then there's a process by which the firms will select you to do an interview on campus. So representatives of that particular law firm come on site. Usually it's over the course of a week or two. And then you're constantly going back and meeting with them. And if they like you enough, then they will invite you to go back to the firm and do a broader set of interviews, usually like a half a day, like a 4-hour interview stint with, call it 4 to 6 people. And then there was typically like a lunch or a dinner or a breakfast, depending on what time your slate of interviews was. Now, I say I got lucky for 2 reasons. Because I did a dual degree program, I actually did quite well my first year of law school, well enough to be within the grade rankings that they would be willing to interview me. But in my second year, I went and did business school in full, and most law firms didn't want to engage me for a summer job when I still had multiple years of school left because it was a 4-year, not a 3-year program. So they would have preferred to recruit me after my second year. And at that point, I was very detached from the law school because I was 100% in the business school. And so I literally wasn't sure that I was even going to go down the path of doing a summer stint. And I was playing basketball with some friends in the gym from the law school who had said, you really should give it a try. It was an amazing experience. And here's the 3 firms we worked at that we really liked. We think you'd also like, just given the kinds of things that you're interested in. So I did some last minute applications. I just happened to be in a period of time, unlike today, where recruiting was going gangbusters. And so people were trying to hire as many associates as they could. The summer class for Cooley at the time was like 120 people. We may be at half of that this year or last year. So like there's always variability depending on, the need for services. It just so happened at that point, it was a very large need. And so when I had said I wanted to interview, they were like, great, we'll meet you. And then from there, I started meeting the people at the firm and ultimately really, really liked who I met. They just seemed like people that, I could really get along with. And, got very fortunate to, secure one of those roles.
And then, so you were offered full time at Cooley after that, but then the 2008 financial crisis hit, and you deferred your role for a couple of years, and then you found this position at a startup, Practice Fusion. Do you think that was a blessing in disguise at the time, and how did that role come about?
It was 100% a blessing. It's still something that to this very day, I think a lot about how much it helped me. And so I'm very appreciative even of the team and the company at the time for giving me a chance. So yes, I did the stint at Cooley over the summer, did my 12 weeks, got a full-time offer to come back once I was going to be done with my last year of school. During that last year of school, there was a major shift in the economy. Several law firms actually ended up going under. And so some of my classmates were literally wearing, they were wearing a sweater of the firm they were going to go work at that all of a sudden didn't exist anymore. So like it became very real within school. And I got a phone call, and my now wife and I were engaged. We were going to get married at the end of that year in August. And I got a phone call from, one of the attorneys at the firm who I still work with to this very day. And she had said, look, there's probably not going to be enough work for you to be full-time busy if you want to come, at the start of the year, but it's your choice. Do you want to come or do you want to do this deferral program where we will pay you basically a portion of your salary to do whatever it is that you want to do for at least a year? And then if there's an opportunity, we'll call you back earlier or not. After some deliberation, I ended up taking the role. It was quite interesting. Every lawyer I knew said, don't take that, go to the firm. Every non-lawyer I knew said, they're going to pay you to do nothing. You got to take this. You got to take this opportunity. So I looked at it as one where I should take it as an opportunity to go work for a type of company that we may service at the firm. So a true startup. So I started applying for startups. And because I had already income supplemented, I actually applied for every type of role I could find, even ones I had no intention of wanting to do. So I kind of, did like a little guerrilla, job activity. And I ended up interviewing at this company, Practice Fusion, for an account management role, which is kind of like an inside sales position. And ultimately, I would have been willing to do that, figuring maybe I'll broaden my role when I get there. But I went, for this 6-person company, sat down with the CEO. Him and I hit it off pretty quickly. And during the interview, started talking about other opportunities within the company. And then ultimately, they ended up giving me a job offer to essentially act as counsel and work in a business development role versus what I had first decided I was going to go interview for to begin with. And, startups at the end of the day, I always argue are, they're starved for people that want to work hard and are willing to do more. I certainly raised my hands. I was, kind of first in, last out for the first 6 or so months. And that really gave me an opportunity to do so many different types of roles within the company. And to this very day, gives me a lot of great flavor for how startups operate. And then it really does inform like the type of advice that you give to a new company, because I realize they don't have a lot of administrative horsepower. So you can't give someone a policy that they can't adhere to that's meant for a large public company to a brand new private one. And there are a lot of things that you can kind of continue to go back and think about given that context in order to, I think, be a better lawyer for the same types of companies today.
And so you went from being in quite a senior role, being involved in a lot of big decisions, and you went back to Cooley, where you would have been at an associate level. And some people might see this as having to go back a step in their career, and some people are quite hesitant about this. What made you go back?
Yeah, great question. And there was a moment in time where I didn't think I was going to go back. So I had called the firm and said, listen, will you give me a 3-year runway here and I can come back in a couple of years because I'm really enjoying the work that I'm doing. And I like being on the executive leadership team and being kind of in the room where it happens, so to speak. And then over time, I started to realize that a lot of the structure of agreements I was putting together and the work that I was doing, as I was getting more ingrained in the company, there were board members that would come and, in all fairness, say, are we really relying on someone who's been doing this for a year or 2 years to be making these kinds of decisions for the company? And I realized I would kind of always carry this potential scarlet letter on my back if I started going down that path of not having kind of earned my stripes from being at a major law firm and getting the training that they offer. So I decided, okay, I'm going to go back and get the training. And originally, again, was thinking a couple of years, maybe then I'll go back and do a similar role and we'll see how it goes. And sure enough, like when you get to the law firm, I had exactly the experience that you mentioned. I went from feeling like I was an executive to feeling like I was the lowest person on the totem pole. Because I think I had gone into the firm as like a second-year attorney. So they gave me some credit for my work, but not full credit. And you go from making all these really important decisions to like, is the formatting correct on a questionnaire that we're sending a board member? Like that is like that can be a deflating experience, but it very much reminded me of like, like some of the movies I've seen growing up, like The Karate Kid, where it's like, okay, you're teaching him how to wax a car, but he's really learning how to do, karate. That's kind of what it's like inside of a law firm where the attention to detail, like, the responsiveness, the professionalism, the service focus, all of those become really important traits that you would use in any career. It's just that you're getting them thrown at you in a very close period of time where you're trying to ramp up. And once I could see 6 months past where I started, I could start to realize the benefits of these things, primarily because we had a new group of summers come in and I realized how much I had learned. I didn't even know what I knew until I could teach them the things that I had learned. And they said, okay, like this is a really powerful tool. If you do it long enough, you're going to be, master of your universe. And I've never looked back.
Having worked at both a startup and in consulting myself, I can definitely relate to you on the fact of it's just a different level of the detail of things you look at when you're at a big law firm or a big consulting firm. It's pretty crazy, but it's really good skills that you can take over to any work that you're working on. And for the work that you do now at Cooley, what does that look like?
Sure. Yeah, I agree with your point completely. Most of the work that I do today essentially is representing high growth venture backed businesses and their investors. And that's everything from literally, 2 professors who are at university thinking about starting a company and helping them go through the process of forming the business, licensing technology that they've been working on in their laboratory, and then starting that company. Or, two people in a garage kind of thing, if it's a tech business. And then ultimately working with them and their company all the way through a sale or an IPO, and then kind of continuing to represent those companies if they go public after those events. At this point, I've had a number of folks I've worked with where we're on the second, third, or fourth company nowadays because we've just gone through that full corporate life cycle and then them starting a new idea. And a lot of my job is essentially acting as, it's almost like being a general counsel without doing the day-to-day work inside the company. So a lot of companies, they don't have lawyers just yet internal. So any issue that they run into, employment, opening up, a development shop in, Latin America, whatever it is, they'll usually give me that first call. And so part of my job is either, is it something that we can do, or we have the existing talent for at the firm, or do I need to bring in others that, are licensed in Argentina as an example, or whatever it is to help with the project. And so I really do enjoy getting a chance to be an advisor to the companies that I work with, which is usually what I spend most of my days doing.
What are kind of the biggest things you do to help startups prepare if they're going through like due diligence?
Yeah, great question. What I normally like to do is I usually actually start the prep the minute we close the financing. I like to start the prep for the next financing. And so what that normally looks like for me is if we close a seed financing, my team and myself will send a note to our client, usually then get on a call and say, okay, when you get to the Series A, here are things that people are going to start looking at from a legal perspective. Same for the B, same for the C, because ultimately over time, there are areas that people will have expected that you've invested in the business. No one's going to think you've done an FTO or freedom to operate when you first start a company. But before you go public, people are going to question, do we have a clean IP landscape? Or before you sell, you're going to have like the ultimate rubber meets the road moment. And no one has an unlimited budget. And obviously, you're trying to grow a business, but do so in a manner that you have the right legal framework. And so I usually like to think about how do you scale those costs and how do you prepare for each step of the way. That's one way that we do that. The other thing is kind of using what happens in the course of a deal as almost like a wake up call for a company. So when you do a venture financing in the US, you're going to give very detailed reps and warranties about the business, some of which no company would meet the standard because they're like risks of the unknown. But there are certain things that you could take preventative measures to protect the company. So you may have a rep that says, I comply with all data security and privacy laws. And the company might say, look, we don't even have a privacy policy, like let alone how we comply with all these things. And so getting into a place where then we can say, okay, look, here's the gold standard. Here's where you are today. There's probably room for some risk that you could take because some of these events are very unlikely. But there are some things that we ought to have buttoned up today because they're immediate risks and they can be a problem with getting to that next financing round. And so taking advantage of the fact of what people are actually looking at the company at the time of thinking about what's going to happen next and therefore where you make your bets. That's one of those other points that we will help with. And then the last piece is really just, I would say it's kind of part of the day-to-day counseling that we try to do. So if our companies move into a category, or if one of my clients moves into a category where there's going to be a focus on a particular legal issue compared to others, then at a minimum, I want to make sure that we've put something on paper that says we've thought about it. Here's why we don't need to comply, or here's what our plan is to comply in the future, if we're not ready to actually do that today. And healthcare becomes a really good example of that. Like I have clients where they offer services where it's kind of matchmaking between like a medical professional and a patient. And there's always a question of like, well, do you have to comply with HIPAA? Are you a business associate under, the relevant legal framework? And it's really nice to be able to tell an investor and their counsel, we looked at it. We don't think so. Here's why. Because even if someone disagrees with you, they're less likely to ding you when you've been thoughtful about the approach than if you just said it's not something I've ever looked at all. And then you give someone else an opportunity to kind of tell you how you should run your business.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And because you work with a lot of startups, what is the biggest mistake you see these companies make from a legal perspective?
Look, I would say to me, the biggest mistake I think that most startups make, there are probably two. So one, and I think they fall into the same bucket, candidly, it all falls around like being overly dilution sensitive. So it's always great to get the maximum valuation possible and retain as much of your economics as you can. I fully appreciate that. And I know it's easy to make the comments I'm making when I'm sitting in the cheap seats and it's not my equity in the company. Um, but if you're growing a business, like you have a hardware company as an example, and you go after the investors that are willing to pay the highest price possible, you are leaving a lot of additional capital behind by definition, because you've now sorted for the folks that are willing to pay the top price, and therefore you're losing some. Well, when you have a company that's very capital intensive, if it's a hardware business, if it's a drug discovery business, if you're flying to the moon, you need a lot of deep pockets around the company for a very long time. And so I would usually, and for those types of businesses, opt trading, the highest valuation possible for one that maybe gives me a broader base of investors, so that I can continue to have like economic support as I grow the company. The same is true for operating flexibility. I feel like, because there is, information asymmetry in venture generally, like if you're a founder and you've never done it before, the terminology can be daunting and intimidating. Investors will have done it before. They'll just know more than you about how the structures work. A lot of founders will optimize for valuation at the expense of operating flexibility. And I always take the view that not everything is going to go perfectly when you form a company from scratch. In fact, I would be surprised if everything goes perfectly. And so do you have enough operating flexibility that you can actually build the company to your vision? Or are you going to be stuck in a manner where the investors are going to control what comes next, depending on how much success that you demonstrate? I usually like to, if someone's going to go to the length of starting a company and sacrifice everything that entails with it to build something, I like to be able to let them see that to fruition. And so I usually opt for saying, how can we build flexibility into your corporate structure over dilution, if that's the trade-off that needs to be made? And it tends to be, to me, like the primary issue that you run into.
Some really good pieces of advice. And in the startup space, it's an environment that really values innovation. How can startups strike a balance between pushing boundaries, but then also ensuring legal compliance?
It's such a great question. So this is one where sometimes you have to get creative at the end of the day and really understand not just what the rule is, but how the enforcement process works for those same kinds of rules. So you may have a rule, as an example, that says if you violate this rule, the government has the ability to fine you or even throw you in jail. And that's like your range of things that can happen. Is you get a warning, you go to jail. That's a pretty big, swath of remedies that are available. And understanding, okay, what happens on a regular basis when people violate these things? Is there really a mechanism of enforcement that people use, or is it theoretical? And then just going back and thinking about the examples of human nature. If someone's going to choose to prosecute you for an issue, or they're going to choose to sue you, a lot of times it goes back to the process that you ran. And so when we work with companies that are doing things that no one's ever done before, and Uber is a great example like that. That's one of our clients that we've worked for a long time, and we have many others who have created new marketplaces. And at one point, the rules, if you read them strictly, may not allow for certain kinds of businesses to operate as they do. But talking with regulators or commercial partners, putting memos together that say why we're going about it the way that we are, so you have good faith basis in the belief of what you're doing. Those are all the kinds of things that can help when you start to have the discussions about this isn't something that has existed yet. That at least people know you're trying to do it in a manner that's at least consistent with the framework as it exists. And sometimes you have to change those frameworks. And we've seen that for lots of companies over the years as well, where all of a sudden the laws change because of the way that they've been conducting business and the consumer demand for the same. It is incredibly rewarding to be part of companies like that essentially, create value and utility for all of us, where, it was literally an idea, or even earlier than that, to begin with. That is like literally the Monday morning reason I wake up every day, is for companies like that.
You actually kind of answered my next question already, which is, in your role, you're often there from kind of seed stage through to IPO, which is a really cool part of your job. What kind of stage of that process, or what part of that role do you find the most fulfilling?
Yeah, great question. So for me, like what I find the most fulfilling is the relationships that I have with the management team that I continue to work with. Over time, those management teams can change. I mean, ultimately, companies may need to bring a GC in or CFO in place if they didn't have them. But really understanding, what keeps my founders up at night, like what they're really worried about in their business, and having the level of relationship where, when they pick up the phone on a Saturday morning to call me and ask a question, like I'm actually excited to pick up the phone and talk to them, even though it may be time with family or whatever it is. And the platform I work on now, like, knock on wood, like affords me the opportunity of getting a chance to work with these really incredibly talented people. So you might have someone who's like the, forefront expert in the category of something, or they've been thinking about a category of company that has never existed before. So they're 5 years into the future from where we're all sitting today, but they can see how this plays out if they do it successfully. And then literally being kind of part of that team to help them solve a category that they are not domain experts in. And it's what I do every day. It is like a extremely rewarding aspect of what I do. And then ultimately at the other end of it, like when the product actually comes to market, whatever that product happens to be, and then you see others find utility in what they're doing, and you know that you played, like, even if it's a small tangential role in facilitating that, that is the kind of thing that, like, it's very inspiring. It's the closest thing that I found in my life that gets back to the feeling of like being an athlete in a sports environment, just because it kind of has that rush to it. I don't know any other way to explain it, but it is an addicting feeling.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I can imagine that would be super rewarding as well. You mentioned earlier that at some stage, when you were working at Cooley, you set your sights on becoming a partner. You decided you wanted to pursue that. What does the partnership process look like at Cooley?
Yeah. So partnership process, and it's always evolving. But ultimately, you come in as an associate, and you are working across the entire platform with all kinds of companies and different types of partners. For me personally, what I found was after the first year, I had formed relationships with 3 or 4 key partners, maybe 5. And those were the people that really supported me and I supported for the breadth of the time I was an associate. When you get to a certain level in the firm, then basically you become, what we call, like, internally, like a senior associate. As you become a senior associate, you go through, basically a process to interview to be a partner in the firm. And, the firm does a really, really tremendous job of going through and evaluating, all the projects that you've done in your career, all the people that you've worked with, getting feedback, getting an understanding of, okay, if you were to make partner here, how do you see yourself operating in our ecosystem? And, what is your role going to be? Are you a capital markets public company security? Are you an M&A lawyer? Are you a litigator, that does med device, or one that does general commercial work? And that really contextualizes then, okay, everything that you've done and the people you've worked with, this is the category of what you're doing. Then the firm can actually really evaluate you based on where it is that you think you want to be and what you want to do. And so it's a great place in that sense of, like, you really choose your own destiny. And then ultimately, depending on how that interview goes and how the feedback goes, you get a favorable nod or not. Favorable nod, then you kind of start your partnership process. And if not, usually for us, I mean, there are people who may not make partner the first chance they go, and then they make partner the next or a couple of years later. And so we've had a lot of those experiences. Generally, I think the view of the firm is, we want to keep all the talented people that ever start here, and we'll find a way to make it work until they get to a level that you are, quote unquote, a partner. And then that's when you get the whole next level of fun.
Can you explain a bit about what the partnership structure looks like? Because Cooley's has over 1,000 employees, which is quite large for the US, but especially large in comparison to kind of Australia and New Zealand firms. What does your role as a partner actually look like within the larger structure of the firm?
Yeah. So, I mean, ultimately, there's over 300 of us that are partners in the firm now. So it is a large partnership. And a lot of it becomes a function of, we are, actually, as the word describes it, we are partners to one another. And so what that entails is that we all agree to take on certain responsibilities to help make sure the firm runs the right way. There are some that are much more administratively focused. There are others who are more practice oriented that still do administrative responsibilities. And people, find where you can make the greatest contribution. So we usually tell clients at the end of the day that we always want people doing their best and highest use legal work. I think we feel the same way about what you do within the framework of the partnership. And so if you have a passion for recruiting or helping training associates or onboarding lateral partners, then you get the chance to make investments in those categories in the firm. For me, one of the areas I became really passionate about over the years, in large part because of just, some historical, medical experiences with family, was really thinking about, healthcare broadly and how we can play a bigger role in that category of company. And so I, became more and more involved in that. Now I chair that group for the firm. And, along with a group of very, very talented lawyers here, we kind of set the direction for what we do and how we work with, and additional services that we offer for, healthcare specific companies. It's not the only thing I do in my practice, but it's kind of one of the ways that I, quote unquote, act as a partner and essentially contribute to the growth of the firm. There are others who work on, like, our form agreements and things like that. And so you really do choose where you can make the biggest impact. And obviously, these are all discussion points that people go through at, office levels and practice group levels and firm levels. And so, lots of thought goes into kind of where you sit and what you do. But we try to do that in as collaborative as a manner as we can.
And in your role now, is mentoring younger attorneys a big part of that?
It is a tremendously large part of that. So we take a pretty unique approach to the relationship between associates and partners, in the sense that, people only work with people they like to work with. And so if you don't like working with a partner, you don't have to. And I think everyone takes takes that very seriously. We want everyone to want to work with us and vice versa. So you kind of create this dynamic of, like, people trying to be, as good of mentors or leaders or coaches as you can to help bring associates through the process. And so I usually kind of live by a rule, which is I want to train at a minimum 2 brand new attorneys every year. And then still maintain the relationships I have with people that I've worked with above them. And ultimately, if I can do more than 2 because the year allows for it from a timing perspective, great. But there's so much to learn that I find it's hard for me to have enough time to train more than 2, newly minted corporate lawyers. But that process, like, it is one of the most rewarding things I think that you get to do, in a law firm environment, because you have people that were trained in a litigation first approach. They come in to do corporate securities laws. Maybe they took a class on, public reporting. Maybe they took a venture law class, all of which they've forgotten by the time they get here. And candidly, doesn't really have a lot to do with the reality of, like, what you do on a day-to-day basis. And some people, it's their first professional career. They've never worked in a corporate environment either. And so you're really teaching people the basics of, like, do you have a signature block in your email? Here's how you save a document on the system. And by the way, this is what a 351 exchange means, and why we want to aim for that when you're doing a deal like X. And what's amazing to me is, again, you get these very hardworking, dedicated people that want to be great at what they're doing, are willing to put in the hours to get there. And all of a sudden you work on the first assignment and, wide-eyed, no idea of what's happening. You do the same project next, and, like, literally, like, they're running through it at a pace that you're like, I don't know how you comprehended everything we just did. But, like, 2 or 3 times later, they're experts in that category and they really know what they're doing. And then ultimately, on the other end of it, when you get a chance to work with someone who started at the firm, goes through, whatever it is, 6, 7, 8 years at the firm, and all of a sudden, they make partner themselves, and, now they have clients that are calling them and essentially looking to engage them specifically. Or I have clients where they stop calling me and they call the associate only. And I will tell you, like, that is also, like, just like an amazingly rewarding experience, because it's like, great. We practice law the same way. And ultimately, like, you have people that love working with you and want you to help them grow their business. I think that's extremely rewarding. And then it's always fun. Every once in a while, they'll come back and ask a random question. You say, okay, I still have utility here for these people. But otherwise, they're independently operating. And that's a great experience here.
Yeah, it sounds like you must be a very good mentor if all these people under you have progressed so well. And what is one piece of advice that you would give to someone who's on their first day and they want to be the best attorney they can be at Cooley?
Yeah, so I have a couple things I usually tell people in that category. And so one is that, one workday you can accomplish more than you could ever imagine. And so, don't worry about how much perception of work that you have in front of you. Just take a deep breath, take one thing at a time, and you'll be amazed at how much you can actually accomplish. Next thing I always try to tell folks is just to make sure that you understand that the learning curve is steep. It's intended to be hard when you first start in law firms. There are a lot of resources available to you, whether it's, our training teams, our online, Q&A platform, or just, walking down the hall and knocking on someone's door and talking to them directly. But ultimately, like, you're not alone in the process. You just have to go through the process of learning to do something that you haven't done before. And every time you grow a new muscle or you do a new workout, that's hard. And so the expectation is that it's going to be difficult, but not that you're doing it alone. And so that's something that I just like people to keep in perspective. And then the third one's like just a little more practical. Get a code book and just read one section, one rule every day. If you can read one rule every day and master that rule, by the time you get through your first 2 years, you will literally be an expert in the code, and you will know things that senior partners have forgotten since, and you become indispensable that way. And so the goal is, every project you do, you want to learn one thing, and that's a way to essentially guarantee it as you work on a transaction.
That's some really valuable pieces of advice that I think a lot of lawyers, even if they're listening in Australia or New Zealand, could definitely take on board. And to wrap up this episode, we have some quickfire questions that I'd like to ask you. So all I want you to do is just say the first thing that comes to your mind, either a sentence or a word. The first one is, what's your dream job if you weren't a lawyer?
If I wasn't a lawyer, I would be a high school basketball coach.
Love it. And if you could change one thing about the law, what would you change?
That I would want people to understand that is not like, how can I eliminate the black and white aspect and make sure that the facts and circumstance tests are clear and precise in how things are weighed. So try to remove the judgment element and try to get more specific, more mathematical.
Interesting. And if you could go back and give yourself one piece of advice before starting your career, what would it be?
I would go back and tell myself to have patience in the process and just make sure at the end of the day that as the more building you are doing, that you are not losing sight of all the infrastructure that you need to have around you in order for that to be successful. But patience would be the most important point of all.
Definitely a good skill to learn. And I saw on Cooley's website that you have a passion for wine. So what is your go-to type of glass of wine?
I love it. So thank you for the question. I have a couple that I like a lot, but nowadays I've been doing a lot of Chardonnay. And so there's a couple that are, local kind of Napa, California vendors that do like a very, buttery type of Chardonnay, goes with everything. My wife's favorite is white wine. And so it makes it really easy to get to open that during the week every once in a while too.
Love it. So thank you so much for joining us, Josh. There's a lot of awesome things that we can pull out of this episode, and I think it'll be a really interesting perspective into US law as well. If people would like to get in touch with you, how can they go about doing that?
Oh, well, thank you for including me, and hopefully this is helpful for folks. Email is great. So either, Jay Seidenfeld at Cooley, or you can, call me as well. So I think all my contact details are on our, Cooley website. And so always open to meeting new people.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of File Notes. To keep up with the latest episodes and content, follow us on LinkedIn and YouTube at File Notes Podcast. You can also visit us on our website at vxt.co.nz/podcast/file notes to subscribe to our email list and never miss an episode. That's vxt.co.nz/podcasts/file notes. See you there.